Okay, so we are delighted to have with us Angela Bennett Segler of NYU English Department, where she is completing her dissertation on mediation, meditation, and the manuscripts of Piers Plowman. And I feel that medievalist, such an alliterative title, it's very appropriate, especially for Piers. And she has this year holds a dissertation fellowship from the Mellon Foundation. She's published or is in the process of publishing essays on manuscript culture, queer studies, and digital medievalism, in which she is, as you see, actually already an expert from her beautiful blog, and has, I think, something of a lot of interest for us, has undertaken a lot of collaborative projects. Maybe, I think, for the digital stuff, most notably with Dr. Jason McClure at Princeton Instruments. And we are now looking at the blog, so I will not again urge you to visit it, but it's really lovely, as you see. And we're really excited to hear from her today and talk to her about Thinking Beyond the Codex, Digital Tools for Medieval Manuscript Networks. So thank you so much for joining us virtually.
Thank you, Claire. So I'm going to start today by recalling a different beginning that I remember from a few years ago.
Okay. You're coming in and out slightly. Sorry.
Is everything smoother now?
Yes, that is good.
Great.
Okay.
So a few years ago, Carolyn Dinshaw and Amy Hollywood came together for a medieval forum event entitled Reading in and Out of Time. And after Carolyn gives her paper, Amy begins by saying, you know what? I really don't care about the Middle Ages. I just don't. And then she says, I care about what the Middle Ages allow me to think. So after a few surprised chuckles, the magnitude of Amy's statement started to sink in for me. So while I won't claim not to care about the Middle Ages, I do, but maybe not as much as I should, and I won't claim not to care about Piers Plowman. After spending all the time with it that I have, it's hard not to. But I can't seem to manage to care about any of the things I'm supposed to care about in any of the right ways. I'll explain what I mean in a minute, but I do want to say, first of all, that we're going to look at several graphs and charts and images, and if at any point we're looking at a graph and you'd like more information or explanation, please don't hesitate to jump in and ask for clarification. The graphs are new and slightly unusual, so if you want to talk about them, make sure you take advantage of them while they're up. So now to the part where I do none of the right stuff in any of the right ways. So there are a number of ways in which digital tools can support or aid traditional codicology. The most common, of course, is the digitization of archives that makes images of manuscript pages available for perusal online. Not only are these massive efforts, I'm going to share this with you, not only are there massive efforts underway to digitize entire collections, but you know, I'm thinking here about these collections, right? The Digital Scriptorium, the Roman de la Rose Digital Library, and a bunch of others that get bigger and bigger, including the database of databases, Manuscripts Online, and the federated databases of MESA. Are you guys familiar with all of these?
Some, not all.
Okay. So there are lots and lots of aggregated sites for manuscript study in digital forms. There's even, this is my favorite site, of course, Sexy Codicology. They have a digital map of every repository that has digitized manuscripts available online, usually for free. These are usually open access. So as you look at all of these, there's a massive movement towards making manuscript pages available. But there are, of course, some limitations to what digitizations can and should do. Some are worried that digital availability will actually accessibility to the physical manuscripts, which would be the case lately at the Parker Library. There are also worries that aspects of materiality are being elided in a privileging of the visual. Of course, there are more basic problems that only certain manuscripts are getting digitized. So in some cases, you have the very pretty manuscripts being available online, but only with the pages that have images, whereas the less pretty manuscripts tend not to get digitized. Because, well, why would you, in some senses? which is really a disadvantage for those of us who work on ugly manuscripts. Accompanying some of these digitization efforts is also the TEI, or Text Encoding Initiative, markups and transcriptions of the manuscript's contents. And these projects range from the deep editing that you get with the Piers-Plowman Electronic Archive and the Archive of Middle English, which is not yet up and running, but this is their Tumblr account in case you want to check that out. All of these tools, however, only allow us to do more of what we have already been doing, which is prioritizing the visual and textual contents in manuscripts and trying to extract almost exclusively that kind of data from them. Their stated goal is to make the material that we have more widely available to do the kinds of studies that we do. Some of these studies aren't strictly textual or literary or art historical. Dot Porter's collation visualization at the Schoenberg Institute and Lynn Mooney's and Simon Horvin's and Estelle Stubbs' late medieval English scribes both tackle different types of codicological data in different ways. And yet, these are both tools to help facilitate the traditional questions that we already ask of medieval manuscripts. What is the text, and or the variant, and who wrote or copied it? And generally, how did they do it? What we find in these collective digital manuscript, these collective digital manuscript endeavors facilitate, however, is an ability to see enough manuscripts, even if at a distance, to begin wondering what other types of questions we might ask of them. Despite what early critics of digitization feared, making manuscript images widely available has actually functioned to bring the materiality of the texts themselves back into focus, rather than obscure it. What seems to have really been hiding the materiality of our medieval texts may in fact have been the collated or recensional editions of our medieval texts in printed books. So let me share with you this image, which is the one that I get to work with. So we'll move here and down to here. Yes. Is anybody familiar? Stop. Is anybody familiar with this particular apparatus?
No.
Narrating, Claire, because I can't see you guys right now.
Sorry.
So this is George Cain's apparatus for the text of. I've lost you guys. There you go. For the text of Piers-Plowman. This in particular is the B text. But if you look at the apparatus at the bottom, that is all of his notes on the manuscripts, right? And frankly, if this particular apparatus isn't enough to scare you off of both Piers-Plowman and its manuscripts, I'm not really sure what will. I'm going to pick on George Cain for a little bit longer, mostly because other people have pointed out his flaws before me. I'm not sure yet if anybody has stated the most obvious thing, which is just that this is unreadable. But the main problem with Cain's text is not its discombobulating aesthetics, but its process of choosing and producing a text. Early in his project, Cain rejected recensional editing, which uses analysis of textual variants to construct a genealogy of textual descent. This then places each of the surviving witnesses in a kind of hierarchical relationship to a reconstructible ancestor, which would presumably be the author's text or one very like it. A recensional approach then would take the earliest or best copy of a text from the manuscript deemed closest to the archetype and only make changes based on variants in the other manuscripts that editors think better represent the archetype. For all his poo-pooing of recension, George Cain actually did a lot of this. But he also did a lot of what he called conjectural emendation, which is my favorite phrase. That is, George Cain was actually amending all the lines with metrical imperfection, chalking them up to careless, stupid, or meddling scribes. And both Anne Middleton and Derek Pearsall have pointed out that essentially what George Cain was doing is producing an edition based on what he thought Langland should have written, and less on what he did or may have written. The problem for Cain, of course, is that there is most certainly a gap between the best reconstructible archetype and the autographed copy. In fact, we know with some certainty that this must be the case, and we're not basing it merely on metrical imperfections that Langland was no doubt too good for. So this is Cain's problem with stematics and their utility. My problem with stemma comes from a different direction. They, like the printed edition and recensional and conjectural emendation both, operate off an idea of what a text should be, rather than what it is. And in this case, what governs that should is nearly always the author and/or his intention. When you look at a traditional stemmatic diagram, it immediately implies the way that it immediately implies from the way that all extant manuscripts are lined up in a row at the bottom. And you know what? I forgot to give you a traditional stemma. So envision, if you will, a family tree where all the extant manuscripts are lined up at the bottom of this tree, and they look roughly equal distances from the originator. If you continue looking at the tree, then you find that some are more generations from the original or the archetype than others, but it's kind of hard to detect, right? But the other thing that I have a problem with is that you don't have any sense of what these manuscripts are in relation to each other. So I'm going to point you to the first thing on your handouts, which is the traditional stemmatic diagram. So that is the very first image that you can get to. And I don't have it here. I have it in a different place. So there we go. Okay. Here we are. So Piers Plumman manuscript stemma and the timeline. So this is a static version of the manuscript stemma, and there's also an interactive version. So you can click on whichever ones of those you'd like, and you can feel free to play with the interactive one because it's quite a lot of fun. So what you're looking at here is the same genetic outline of manuscript relationships to each other, but this time they are spaced according to time, right? Empty nodes, nodes that don't have a label, they stand in for the passage of time, and they're placed there so that manuscripts that emerge at the same time are lined up vertically. So when you look at this particular stemma, and I won't go into too many details because there just isn't time, but what you can see is that the manuscripts that are least removed from the archetype, that is, they are the fewest generations away, those manuscripts, so I'll give you an example, the fewest generations away are these down here at the bottom. You only have 1, 2, 3, 4. You only have 4 generations, or in this case, at the very bottom, you only have 3 generations separating it. The ones that are least amount of generations from the archetype are, in fact, the most removed in time. So when you're looking at a traditional stemmatic diagram, you would get the sense that these must be closest to the archetype. But in fact, they tend to be the farthest removed from when the archetype could have existed, which leaves a lot of time in between for a lot of changes to happen. And the opposite is also true, which is the ones that are the most generations away, so these ones here at the top, those tend to be the ones that are the least removed in time. So the very earliest manuscripts of the A text in particular happen to be this AC text at the very top, which was made in circa 1400, or the Vernon down here at the bottom, and they have many more generations that we know must have come in between that text and the archetype. So it's a little bit deceptive when you look at traditional stemmatic diagrams to try and figure this out. And it kind of gets messy when you start taking into consideration both the time and the stemmatic or genealogical relationships. But it's precisely this mess that I'm interested in. With increasing access, digital or otherwise, medieval manuscripts increasing access to the medieval manuscripts, more people are engaging with the complex material textual production of meaning in the Middle Ages. Editions are no longer universally held up as the ideal form of presenting a text, with all of those corruptions from the interfering scribes excised with surgical precision. And people are beginning to wonder, what else can we know? But what do we do with medieval manuscripts other than treat them like printed books? And this is where I really get on my soapbox. So you're going to have to excuse me for a minute, because the Codex, quite simply, is not a printed book. It's just not the same. I'm not an expert in printed books, so I'll talk about what print allows by using the language of affordance. So an affordance, as defined by Don Norman in The Design of Everyday Things, oops, and I said Newman, is, quote, a relationship between the properties of an object and the capabilities of the agent that determine just how the object could possibly be used. The affordances of printed books have become so naturalized for us that we carry these assumptions into our interactions, not only with books, but with other textual technologies, including, of course, digital forms of reading, but also older technologies. A standard book tends to have a single long text written by one author, imprinted on successive front and back pages that are then assembled into an order, bound and sold en masse. We cannot escape the role that mass production plays in determining what a book is for. The process of printing is literally taking something that we consider to be blank, white surface of paper, and impressing it with meaning, the same meaning over and over again. Those little homogenized nuggets of meaning are then assembled and ordered by the hundreds or thousands, and then separated from all the other identical nuggets by a paper or pressed board cover that keeps all the nuggets marching in line in their proper order, and not interacting with or referring to one another. Why would they? They're all the same. When we receive a book, we interact with its affordances. We pay more attention to the words than to the page. It's designed to do that, to erase its own materiality and showcase text rather than its supports. It does such a good job of erasing its own materiality that we refer to books as texts, and we didn't really notice the gap between the two until the book itself literally started to disappear into electronic media. Ebooks are essentially the ideal form of the book. They are a near-Platonic realization of disembodied text. Though we do have to be really careful not to forget the materiality of the things we use to read the books, the ebooks. But those aren't the books themselves anymore. The books themselves come in an electronic format, and we had forgotten that we actually cared about the material that brings the book to us, or the text to us. When we read manuscript pages online, this is the set of practices we bring to them, particularly if we are not careful. But a codex is not, and frankly never was, a blank and passive receptacle for text. And when we read it as such, we obscure all of the other kinds of information it carries, and the affordances it makes for its users, whom I will not call readers, since not all uses for manuscripts were strictly reading. While a codex is occasionally a vessel for transmitting the text of a single long work, it is never exclusively that. And the work, the labor it contains, belongs as much to the scribe that produced it as it does to either the author of the text or the readers thereafter. In fact, if we think about all the aspects of a codex that might be meaningful, we would have to resort to a kind of elaboration and amplification that would shame even Geoffrey of Bensoff. The parchment is more than a surface on which to write. It's a skin of an animal. It's the product of several intensive human, chemical, and mechanical labors that transform it from a skin into an ordered network of collagen fibers. But if we take another step back, the animal itself is part of a complex economy in which the value of its parts are weighed against the costs of its value, against its costs and the values of its whole, as well as the value of its life. It exists within an ecology that determines what kind of animal it is, what kind and color of skin it yields, and even what kinds of blemishes it may have, thanks, of course, to the local insect populations. Its genetic history also determines its pigmentation, its elasticity, its relative collagen to water to fat content, which in turn affect the size, texture, and tensile strength of the writing support it yields. The same kind of deepening or widening gaze can likewise be applied to the codex's other elements, to the ink that bonds chemically with the molecules inside the parchment, to the oak galls and iron scrapings that are used to make it, to the geese whose feathers are used to apply it, the animals and trees that supply the binding materials, etc., and so on and so forth. Any way that you look at a codex, if you look past the text, you find that the object itself emerges from a network of materials and actions that work in concert to produce an object. It isn't merely a product of human labor, as though the materials from which it is made are somehow raw and devoid of context themselves. When we look at the codex in this way and consider that each one is a unique witness to its particular circumstances and relationship to the new movements and materials within this network, it seems to me that the object itself becomes significantly more interesting than any relationship it has to a mythical author. This codex right here in front of us, which is imaginary because we're not in person with a codex, this one is doing the work of literature. It is instantiating it, upholding it, and maintaining it. At some point in the past, a number of different actors were also doing that work to bring this object into being as a codex. As such, it is not a simple single thing, but an assemblage. So here I was going to take you through a little bit of Deleuze and Guattari, but I want to kind of move ahead so that we can get to the graphs and the good stuff a little bit quicker. So I'm going to just say that the assemblage is, of course, a multiplicity. It looks like a unity because you define its boundaries, but it is in fact a multiplicity, which I illustrated in talking about all of the other things that are connected to the idea of a codex and that expand every time you try to take into account yet another thing and yet another thing that it's connected to. So if we zoom out from the single codex, we might see a corpus, or a set of all the manuscripts containing the same work, or a work by a single author. If we zoom out from that again, we might see connections to other works in the same language, or if we expand once more, we might see all of the other works or codices that are made in late medieval England, or all of the other languages in which people were producing texts. Each time we zoom out, we see a new single entity, but we also uncover that it is multiple. And all of these unities are really just the way that we're defining our object, which we must admit are not unities per se. All of the descriptions, codex, work, author, language, period, place, history, they don't actually separate entities, nor do they designate entities that were already separate before we named them that way. Rather, they designate different or distinct components of a much larger, complex, and integrated phenomenon. Particularly, they designate which pieces or aspects of the phenomenon we care about, which means, yes, we are implicated in the way we make these kinds of cuts and boundaries to designate the differences that we are interested in. Indeed, even the way that we've defined many of the possible boundaries for our object, including codex, work, author, language, all of those are already assuming that the main thing we can know from any of these assemblages is textual information. We could have chosen instead to delineate by scribes, or by materials, or by merchants, or personal bookmaking, or professional bookmaking culture, or monastic bookmaking culture. Each time we make a decision like this, we limit ourselves to investigating a particular cross-section of a multivariate phenomenon. And here we get to the part that you thought you came for. What the digital tools allow us to do beyond digitization is to rethink our object of study, to see it as an assemblage, or as part of an assemblage, and to make connections between our objects of interest to a much wider, much more integrated phenomenon, whether that phenomenon is historical, material, textual, or whatever. Anytime we take account of our object, we take a slice of this large phenomenon, and the slice is defined by the parameters that we use. If we use recensional editing, for example, we can only get certain outcomes, and those outcomes can only be certain kinds of information. If we use other interfaces, say graphical ones or aggregated data, we can see entirely different cross-sections of a larger phenomenon, and we can bring into focus whatever cross-sections we can dream up an apparatus to take a look at. So the questions that really drive me producing the apparatuses that I have constructed is, what is the entity that we call Pierce Common, right? exists in all these different forms, in all these different ways, in all these different places, and yet we call it all the same thing. And how do we make that determination? As you may have guessed, I am rather dissatisfied with the answers to those questions. And these questions might, in fact, be too big for one person to answer. So instead, I try to see as much data about the manuscripts as I possibly can in a single glance. So I'm going to take you to the next part of your handout, which is the circle packing diagram. It's the blue circles that you can feel free to play with. They are interactive, this particular data. So I'm going to screen share and go to the same place, but you don't have to go to the same one that I'm going to. So this is the circle packing diagram. All right. So here is one of the ways that I tried to answer the question, what is Pierce-Plowman? What you see in this diagram is a collection of white dots that each represent one of the manuscripts that contains a complete or near complete copy of the poem. Each one stands in for both the manuscript, and it is proportional to the size of the poem within the manuscript. And then this collection of dots have been divided and subdivided, the whole corpus, based on the most prevalent differences in each group. The most obvious distinction to me is whether or not a given corpus contains a lot or a little of the poem. So over here on the left, we see the dots that are much smaller than the others, and those are, of course, the manuscripts that contain a little of the poem. So I call that the short text. So you can also see that within this, each of these groups is further subdivided as we get down to it. But in the other one, the same thing is happening. So this is the long text. It has clearly more versions of the poem, or more instantiations of it. And it's, again, subdivided into two major groups. We have B endings and C endings, and the B endings and C endings are also, again, both subdivided into two major groups. C endings are based on whether or not you have a pure C text, or whether or not you have a combination of two texts in a single manuscript. So I'll let you guys continue to have a look at that while I make a few comments. As you can see in this diagram, the more accurate you get, so if we go all the way in, we see individual names of manuscripts, the more each of your categories will actually speak more to specifics than they do to broad generalizations. So when you're looking at an abstraction of this data, you are always beholden to the trade-off between generalizing and seeing patterns and the ability to see specifics and individual details close up, which reminds me very much of a short story by Borges, in which cartographers created an ever more precise map that eventually grew so accurate with one-to-one proportions to the real thing that it ultimately became the thing it was trying to map. Data of any kind is an abstraction from the thing that it is trying to describe. Data and any aggregate presentation of it thus has a distancing effect. I think we lost track of Franco. Oh, Franco Moretti has disappeared from my slides. How convenient. Wily Franco, she's just taken off. So you're just going to have to listen. Sorry about that. So Franco Moretti describes this method, or his method, of reading as distant reading. And he describes it this way. He says, within that old territory of traditional literary study, a new object of study emerges. Instead of concrete individual works, a trio of artificial constructs, graphs, maps, and trees, in which the reality of the text undergoes a process of deliberate reduction and abstraction. This is distant reading, where distance, quote, according to Moretti, is not an obstacle, but a specific form of knowledge, wherein fewer elements produce a sharper sense of their overall connection. These are shapes, relations, structures, forms, and models, instead of the details that usually drive our reading of literary work. In talking about how to deal with an entire corpus of the 19th century British novels, Moretti uses a network analysis to say that this field cannot be understood by stitching together bits of knowledge about individual cases because the system is too big. It is a collective system that has to be grasped grasped as a whole. And graphs are one way, and possibly the only way, of doing this. So while Moretti's formulation here is helpful to understand how these kinds of abstractions operate, I should say that what I'm doing I would not call distant reading proper. And I certainly wouldn't say what Moretti does, which is that data doesn't need interpreted. Data always needs interpreted, and anybody who's done any science can tell you that. In fact, Bruno Latour, who is the interrogator extraordinaire of what we call facts, argues that it's precisely the process of interpretation or abstraction that allows a material thing to yield information or data. What is important about Moretti's work is that he tells us that such abstractions and inscriptions can be useful for the study of literature. And here Moretti and Latour agree. The only way to get a sense of a large, complex, interconnected phenomenon is to zoom out, to abandon the scrutiny of the individual, even for a moment, in order to see an aspect of the larger phenomenon. Now, lest we think that abandoning the scrutiny of the individual is abandoning the individual itself, Latour clarifies and tells us that this is not the case. In fact, the inscription or the abstraction that we put in a chart or a graph is never a substitute or a surrogate for the material phenomenon itself. Rather, it is an abstraction that can act as a guide to the larger phenomenon. So in my work, I focus on the text as an assemblage, and I take each manuscript witness as an equally co-constitutive work or node in a network of texts and objects. The Peirce corpus, and now we're going to go to the graphs, and this is the point where I want everybody to just ask questions, ask away. The Peirce corpus is simply the collection of Peirce texts within each of the Peirce manuscripts. But it also consists of all the other works alongside Peirce in the manuscripts, which we can see in a single inscription here. So at this point, I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to ask you to speak instead of just nod or make movements, because I'm looking at the same thing you're looking at. Have you guys seen this particular graph before? I know some are reading the blog.
No. I have.
Okay. So Claire knows all about it, and Claire doesn't have. So we'll kind of talk. I'll talk through this, and please ask questions as you're doing it. This is also on your handout, so you can zoom into it on your own computers and tablets and have a look at it. So what you're looking at here is a collection of nodes and edges. Those are the properties. So each of these places where data aggregates, these points on the graph, these are the nodes. And you can see that some of them are clearly bigger than others. That's because the bigger nodes represent more occurrences. Now the edges, the things that connect all of these nodes, these indicate that these two works that are represented by each node occur together in a particular manuscript, right? So the more nodes that one node is connected to, the more times it occurs with all of these other things. So when you're looking at this, you get a kind of visual index of how often a work occurs in a particular corpus and what else it occurs with, right? So I'll just ask you guys what you notice about this graph, and if you have any questions, please do ask them. So what do you notice about this graph?
I actually have a question while people are thinking about what they noticed, which is this is the thing that has to be in all of these is Peirce-Plowman, right? This is absolutely everything that occurs in any manuscript with Peirce-Plowman. With a complete Peirce-Plowman, or with, you were talking about complete and incomplete?
Yes, that's a really good question, Claire. So this graph is built around co-occurrence with Peirce-Plowman. So Peirce-Plowman has to be in the manuscript. For just the sake of clarity, I'm only including manuscripts that have a complete or once complete portion of the poem. So things that are missing front and back leaves are also included, because at one point we assumed that it was complete. I should also say that including manuscripts that have only the first 8 passes, because there seem to be several manuscripts that included only those passes, and that's all they ever wanted. And if that's a complete poem to those compilers, I just went with that. Sure, that's complete. That is what you're looking at.
Okay, great.
Any observations from the peanut gallery? Okay, I'll take you through some of my favorites then, and if anything occurs to you, do feel free to jump in. So the thing that I find most intriguing about this graph is that, first of all, Langland does not really appear to be the Ricardian poet, like to exist in this very Ricardian context that J.A. Burrow wants to say that he's in, right? Piers Plowman never, ever circulates with Gower. Doesn't happen. So even though Langland, Chaucer, and Gower are often spoken of together as these Ricardian poets, Langland and Gower do not happen, ever. And Langland only appears with Chaucer one time, total of one time. At the very top, sort of in the middle of your graph, there's Troilus and Cresside, and you can see that. And the only time that those two things ever occur together is in the weirdest Piers Plowman manuscript. It is absolutely the strangest Piers Plowman manuscript, which is Huntington Manuscript 114, that George Cain literally says is, quote, rejected for editing. He's like, forget this. I don't know what's going on in this manuscript. Done. We're done. I'm not touching it. So the only time Piers and Chaucer occur together is in this very, very strange manuscript. So that is the fact of what Piers does appear with most often. So you can see that big cluster on the right-hand side of the graph. Everybody can have a good look at that, right? So yeah. That cluster represents the Vernon manuscript. And I should say this is definitely an oversimplification because the Vernon has like 400 works in it. So I did have to kind of distill that a little bit into collections of things and named works so that we could actually see some patterns. So this too is an interpretation. This is a choice that I've had to make this graph legible. But you can see at the very bottom of that big fat cluster, you have the writings of Richard Rolla. So in here, you can see that the writings of Richard Rolla occur more often than any other kind of text or single text anywhere else on the graph other than Piers, right? It is the second biggest node. I think that Piers Plowman occurs with Richard Rolla 12 times in the manuscripts, which I find really fascinating. So that seems to me to indicate that there's a different kind of context that we should be reading Piers Plowman in. And if it seems like it might be a little too easy, because there's a lot of meditative and contemplative works, I will make it more complicated by saying the single work, rather than author or genre, that Piers Plowman occurs with most often is the Travels of John Mandeville. In the upper left-hand corner of the graph, you've got those histories of Britain, Mandeville's travels, and histories of Troy that kind of hold together a couple of clusters up there. So single work with which Piers travels most often is Mandeville, which is quite a thing to attempt to make sense of. So, that's what's going on in the Piers Plowman context. And what ends up happening is instead of reading Langland in relationship to Chaucer, I would argue that we need to be reading Langland in relationship to these works that Piers Plowman was being produced alongside of. Does anybody have questions before I jump to the Chaucer graph? Questions? No? Okay.
I have a question. I guess I just don't quite understand what the benefit is of organizing this information in this particular spatial way as opposed to narratively as you just did. You know, it's like I'm just wondering what insights do you feel like you're deriving about reading these texts together from the spatial diagram as opposed to a kind of a verbal or narrative account of which manuscripts or which text Piers shows up most often with?
Sure, that's a really good question. The big difference for me is that all of that information that you're getting on a graph the only way to actually do all of it narratively or in some kind of sequential order is through a catalog, which would be awesome if it existed, but it doesn't, is the first problem. And the second thing is that it would be lots and lots and lots of pages. So you would be encountering all of this information just laid out in a string, and it's a lot harder to see particular kinds of patterns in that information if it comes out linearly. So the only reason I'm able to tell you this narrative about what Piers-Plowman circulates with is because I've been able to look at all of that, and I didn't have to make a list and say and count and like tabulate how many times it circulates with John Mandeville, and then compare that to how many times it circulates with the Form of Living, and then to think, well, do I want to compare it just to the Form of Living, or do I want to compare it to anything from Richard Brella, right? So all of that kind of aggregating is done for me, and that allows me to kind of pick up on patterns that maybe are not as obvious. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the proximity and distance of the actual little bubbles to the Piers-Plowman bubble, they're not, so the spatial proximity or distance is not actually meaningful in the account that you're describing. It's more it's really the size of the bubbles. Like you're not, yes. Closeness here is not a metaphor for some other kind of closeness.
Yes. And is this Sita?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Now I can see you because I pulled you up on the screen. Hello. So it's a really good question. So on the graph that we're looking at, and I'll go ahead and bring that back up, proximity is not calculated. So there is a way to do that and where proximity is meaningful, but for us, it really doesn't tell us anything. What's meaningful on this graph are the connections and the size of the nodes. So where things are placed are really qualitative, right? And it's really about connection. And what you're seeing in this graph is really a qualitative graph, bringing together these different kinds of co-occurrence, but it's not measuring how much that co-occurrence happens except by the size of the nodes. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Does that also, I'm also curious about the spatial, does that also apply to what's left and right of Piers-Plowman, that is also inconsequential, or does that have meaning?
Yes, well, in this graph, where things are placed is not as important as what they are connected to. Where things are placed is really largely a function of trying to make the connections legible. When the graph itself auto-populates, it's actually just a tangle. It's just a big mess, and it is impossible to tell what's what until you kind of pull the things apart. And when the graph is, we'll call it fresh, when it's just been generated, you can actually pick up each of these nodes and move it.
Right.
You can see more clearly. So that's what's called a live graph. And when the graph is live, being able to move it helps you to arrange things. But of course, as soon as you move it, any calculations that the computer did based on proximity just completely break down. So you kind of have to trade off. You can get these graphs that are computer generated and where the spatial arrangement does have meaning, but then you, as a user, a human, you can't read it because they're all on top of each other. Does that make sense?
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So the sort of concentration that we have in the oval to the right, where you have the roller, that's something that that's your subjective opinion that these are things that should be placed so that they create this sort of denser network, and you could potentially have created that denser network with any of the points, or is this a way of indicating, not unlike, say, a stemma, that you think that these are related texts that have some kind of genetic relationship to each other?
Great question. So the cluster itself, it is clustered by connection, which means, and those I can't change. Those are the one things I cannot do anything.
But if you spread them out, would it not look as densely connected as it does the way that you've arranged it?
Right. It would look like the one on the left, right? If it
will not.
Spread out.
The one on the left.
And I'll tell you why. So this cluster on the right, the reason it looks as bad as it does is because it's got about 40 nodes in it, and they all have to be connected to each other. So there's no way that you can spread those nodes out in which they'll look like the cluster on the left, which has about 20 nodes. So it has about half as much, a little bit less, as the one on the right. So that's why it looks less dense, because it is. It just has less data in it. So these nodes over here, sorry, you can't see where I'm pointing, but the nodes on the right, their clustering is really a fact, or is really related to the fact that they are all occurring in the same manuscript. So I can pull them apart or push them together as much as I want, but they're going to look that way no matter how I do it. In fact, let me show you. All right, I've got to Google this, but I can show you what that actually looks like. Here, we'll go here and we'll pull up the Vernon. So this same data is actually way down here in this blog. So let's see, where'd you go? There we go. So if I were to just take that cluster and pull those apart, I would be able to show you this.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so this is a much clearer demonstration of everything that's in that cluster. And you can still see that everything is connected to each other. And now that we've pulled it apart farther and you can kind of distinguish what's happening in the guts of it, you can tell that some of these connections themselves are fatter than the other edges.
Mm-hmm.
Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. So when you're looking at that, what you're seeing is that these bigger circles that occur more often inside even just this one manuscript, their connection, their co-occurrence index rises as much as their individual occurrence rises. That might have been a little technical. Does that make sense?
So you're saying this is all one manuscript tradition, and some of these texts are in it more often than others.
This is actually a single manuscript, I think.
Yeah, this is one manuscript. Just one.
This is the crazy, enormous one.
Yes. This is which is my favorite manuscript ever because it's enormous. This is the one that's got 400 different works, or at least 370, and it is made up of like 220 individual bifolia, which means it would have taken an entire animal for each page. So you're talking about like an entire herd of calves to make this manuscript, right? But that's why that cluster is such a wreck. That's why it's so big, is because it's got a ton of different works in it. And so when you look at it, you're seeing that some of these works are occurring more than once, right? The Vernon loves meditation, so you've got a lot of different meditations on Christ's Passion. It also likes disputes, which I've grouped together as a genre instead of just listing each one individually. You've got a dispute between the body and the soul. You have a dispute between a Christian man and a Jew. You have a dispute between, I think, Abraham and a New Testament figure. I'm forgetting exactly who that was. But you have all of these different things going on in one manuscript, and that's why they have to be connected to each other, is because they co-occur. They occur together in one context.
So there are two copies, for instance, of the Mirror of St. Edmund, or more than two Mirror of St. Edmund in the Vernon manuscript?
Where are you looking, Claire?
Mirror of St. Edmund is like middle, slightly right.
Middle, slightly right. No, so you can see all of the smallest nodes are roughly.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yes, I see. I see. I'm looking at the wrong.
No, that's fine. I did make them a little bit bigger on this graph just so that they would be visible.
Right.
And it makes it easier to read. So the Mirror of St. Edmund occurs once.
Got it.
But, you know, things like the Life of Christ occur actually several times. And there are several different writings of Richard Rolla. And then, of course, there are a bunch of different versions of the Paternoster, which I find really fascinating. There's the table, the Paternoster table, which, if we go back, I think I have an image of that. Yeah, this, right? Oh, yep, back we go. The Paternoster table, which is, I'll just do this. it's cheating, but it's pretty good. So this itself is a copy of the Paternoster prayer, but then there's also a verse version of it in Middle English, and then there is a translation of it, and then there's one of it where it's intertwined with another devotional poem, so people can be doing their Paternoster at the same time that they're also reading another poem.
Huh.
So that's why that occurs so many times in that particular manuscript, and that's why the node gets so much bigger. So the more often that a text occurs in the manuscript, the bigger the node is. So when you go back to looking at the corpus graph, so that same amount of data, let's go back to, here we are, that same data is exactly what's occupying. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's what's occupying this cluster. So you just saw that exact same amount of data pulled apart a little bit. Does that help to clarify what you're looking at?
Yes, I have one other question. So the Paternoster is a good example here. So you have additional lines from the Paternoster going to some other things kind of north of it, right? So that indicates that a common occurrence of Piers Plowman plus the Paternoster plus some of these other things, right?
Yes.
In different instances. But if the size of this node suggests that you have clustered within it several different Paternosters, right? Then when you draw the line then to, let's say, the Latin tract on Edward the Confessor, how do you know which version of the Paternoster is the common occurrence that you're describing there, that is the Latin tract and the Paternoster and Piers Plowman? Because
in this graph, you don't.
Okay.
And so what you would have to do is you would have to disambiguate. So let me show you an example of that I have done. So I'm going to pull this up in a different, so I didn't originally have this pulled up, so let me find it. But what you have to do is you have to kind of pull the node apart in order to actually see what we're getting. So let me just grab, oh, here we go. Okay, these are not, they're not coming up in the easy way, so I got to do it the hard way. So when you pull the node apart, that changes the nature of the connections. You can't necessarily know what it's going to stay connected to after the fact. It's not possible. So this particular graph only shows you this particular data. Let's see. There's the disambiguated one. I'm going to show you, so what I'm working on right now is data from the Rolla manuscripts. So I'm going to put these together and then I'll open that up on the screen share right now. So all right, so we have to stop sharing this and we're going to share this instead. Okay, so what you're looking at is this is just a graph of Rolla's Emendatio Vitae in Middle English, right? And what other Richard Rolla works it circulates with. So the first thing that I did when I looked at all the Rolla manuscripts, because there are so many, is I just made a graph of what Rolla circulates with what other Rolla, right? So this is the Emendatio Vitae, and it tends to circulate occasionally with the Form of Living, and occasionally with the Fire of Love, and then just a little bit with these other works, the Commandment, Ego Dormio, and then these sort of one-off things, the Exempla, and one time it's with the prologue to the Prose Psalter. But there are 7 different versions of the Emendatio Vitae, so in order to try and figure out which version circulated with what, I had to pull that big fat node in the middle apart. And this is what's called disambiguating, right? Like, and to see which one occurred more often and which one was attached to what other works. Is that pretty clear?
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
Other questions? If you don't have them, I can take us to Chaucer and we can do a comparison of Piers and Chaucer.
I still have a question, and then I'm afraid I'm going to have to go. I wish I could stay. This is so interesting. But along the lines of the disambiguation, I mean, I do think that there is a little bit of a sleight of hand in not making a distinction between manuscripts when you talk about occurrences. So that if you're counting each occurrence as a one, as it were, whether it's in one single text
Right.
or in a different text. So your Paternoster is a good example of that as well, not just in terms of the variance, but if you have 3 in one text, I would think, as somebody thinking about what this graph is representing, that those 3 somehow count differently than a 1 that would be in a separate manuscript, for me at least.
Sure.
And so that when you get that big blob there, it seems to me that that's saying there are X number of manuscripts in which this is happening, just as it is off on the other side. But what you're telling me is, in fact, what that's saying is it's happening multiple times in the same manuscript, which seems different.
Well, so anytime you use one of these graphs, there are limitations to what it can tell you,
Yeah.
right? In this graph, all that you can actually see is how many times one of these works occurs within the corpus. And because we're not, at the moment, making manuscript to manuscript distinctions, then you're right. That's erasing what's in a manuscript multiple times and what's in, say, more manuscripts, right?
Yeah.
So there are limitations that you do, which is why you never want to take one graph and say, this is it.
Mhm.
It's the whole picture, because it isn't. It's never the whole picture. So the only way that you can get a sense of the bigger picture is to accumulate graphs. You have to aggregate them.
Mhm.
It is a kind of, I call this process collective reading, because you both collect data, and then you also collect these images, these inscriptions of your data, and you have to have multiples in order to try and see these relationships clearly, because your graph can only ever bring one relationship or one kind of relationship into focus at a time.
Yes, I mean, but at the same time, I mean, you are sort of, by deciding to, say, combine all the rolla together into one title rather than to divide those into their individual elements. You also make that node seem bigger. If they're all in one manuscript, you would think in a graph like this that you would want to represent their individuality. So I mean, what I'm saying is, I mean, it seems to me that in some ways your big nodes here are a function of subjective choices that you're making about the representation, rather than sort of there being something that naturally emerges. Is my
Right. Well, data in general are not actually, they're not objective. They're always subject to the choices that you make and how you collect them.
Absolutely.
So this data in this graph, some of the choices that went into making this graph were things like, what do I care about? Well, I care about what Piers Plowman was circulating with. Well, and why do I care about it? Well, because I kind of want to know what I can learn from its manuscript partners, we'll call that, the text that it co-occurs with, whether or not I should be reading it as one genre or another. So in this particular graph, it was good for the question I was asking to think about Rolla as a genre, because he's writing mostly contemplative works. And so for me, when I'm trying to think about the genre of Piers and not the genre of Rolla, then it makes sense for me to kind of generalize about Rolla and to focus on these individualities more about the Piers manuscripts, right? So I have a succession of other Piers graphs that break this apart into different ways, and that don't investigate any of the other works more, right? And that's actually what later chapters are doing. So the chapter I'm working on right now is on Richard Rolla, and there are a lot of Rolla graphs, a lot of them, because there's a lot of Rolla works. And that's where the Rolla node gets pulled apart, and we think about what's occurring together and how much does it count if you have a manuscript that has the form of living, Emendatio Vitae, and Piers Plowman. How much do we care that those two Rolla works are side by side and not dispersed throughout the corpus. And that's a question that I'm asking in the next chapter. And then the one after that, which is already drafted, is asking the same question about John Mandeville, right? And why are these things together? So the overview graph is really only giving us a glimpse of the kinds of questions that we can ask, and then we have to first, I made the graph with a certain parameter and a certain direction, and then I have to ask more questions to clarify some of those things that are not very clear or that get elided in the original graphs. Does that make sense?
It's interesting because it makes, and I am very far from knowing how much computing power and complexity would need to go into this. It makes one wish for these all to be live all the time, right? So that you could shuffle through them and undo them and say, well, I want to make the peers into A, B, and C text and see, and then see what the things look like, right? You know, that sort of, I don't know if that's something that you are working on or working toward. I can imagine it would be really hard to have something work like that, but
yes, well, that is, of course, that is the grand plan. Is so as long as these images are static, then they can only ever show you the one thing that they were made to show you. But if we can take all of this data and we can build it into an infrastructure that makes it searchable and that makes these connections automatically, then we can actually generate these graphs on the fly, and we can tell the graph whether we care about all of Rolla together or whether we care about the individual works of Rolla. And we can tell the graph whether we care about all of Pierce-Plowman together, or do we care about the A, B, and C texts of Pierce-Plowman, right? So we can, the idea is to build an infrastructure for data that then just allows you to extract the bits of data that you want. Before we can do that, before we can put all of that into some sort of online infrastructure, you have to actually build the database first. And the only thing that you can work with before the database is functional is the snapshots that you get, right? So if the larger phenomenon is sort of interconnected and emerging depending on how you look at it, then all you get with a graph is a snapshot of how it looks from one particular angle at one particular moment.
Mm-hmm. Which is still pretty neat.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. I'm sorry I have to sneak out.
So we, I'm looking at my timer now, and we're at right at about an hour. And so I want to know if we want to just open up to more questions in particular, or if you want to look at a different graph and kind of see what we're talking about in a different context. It's entirely up to you guys.
I actually have a general question, and then I'm very willing to take the feeling of the meeting on this, which is whether you came to this with the computer skills, or a good subset of them that you needed, or whether you realized you wanted to do this and then built those skills.
Not at all. I didn't have any of these computer skills when I started this process. I went right after I got my prospectus approved. I got a grant to go to the UK, and I was there for 5 months, and I just went traipsing around, looking at all the manuscripts, trying to absorb whatever it is that people can absorb from looking at manuscripts. And I wasn't really sure what I was looking for or what I would find, and I was just trying to have an open mind about the kind of information that I could get instead of going with an agenda. And so I did this, and I looked at, let's see, by the time I came back, I'd looked at over 40 of the Pierce-Plowman manuscripts. And then right after I got back, I went out to the Huntington, and I went to the Morgan, and I saw everything, all but 6 of them in person. And then I saw another 4 in reproductions, right? So the Vernon, they wouldn't let me look at in person, so I saw a facsimile of that. So I had all of this information just kind of swimming in my head, and I just kept thinking that there had to be a better way to do this. By the time I got home, I had 240 pages of manuscript notes, which was ridiculous. I mean, what am I going to do with that other than maybe publish a catalog someday? I mean, I can't do anything with that information and make an argument from it. And so I started to try and think about the relationships that I wanted to be able to see. And after having looked at these manuscripts, it seemed really important that we weren't talking about what else Piers was circulating with in the Middle Ages. We were always talking about Piers and Chaucer, or we're talking about Piers and the other alliterative poets, which really interestingly, he almost never, or Langland, almost never circulates with other alliterative poets, the one exception being the Epistle of Susanna. So those things don't really seem to make a natural context to me. And so I was really interested in trying to think about the kind of context that all of these other works that Piers was copied alongside of, what kind of context that they might make for the poem that might change how we looked at it. So this kind of graph was something that I really wanted to be able to see but didn't know how to do, and I had to work with several different people and data specialists and programmers to figure out how to even make the graph. And then about 6 months after I attempted it, I had been working with one programmer in particular, and he called me up and he's like, okay, so I think I figured something out, but I don't know what I'm looking at all. And we went in, and he opened it up, and I looked at it. I'm like, yes, that has been in my head for 6 months. I know someone else can see it. It's there. So it was a really long, arduous process. And then after doing that, and this becoming a major component of the kind of work that I'm doing, I started developing more skills. So at first, I learned how to do this one thing, and one thing only, in one program. And then as I started thinking about the bigger project behind this, I grew a skill set. So basically, whenever I see something that somebody knows how to do that I think would be useful for my data, I go and learn how to do it, either from the person who made it or from somebody who has worked with that format before. So this is all stuff that I've taught myself or been taught by a collaborator in the last 2.5 years. Other questions?
Chaucer, yeah sorry.
Chaucer.
Chaucer?
Okay. So let me go ahead and get back to our screen share, and let me also put you guys back on my camera. There we go. And okay, so I did Troy first because that's what Piers occurs alongside. But we can also look at the Canterbury Tales or the Parliament of Fowls or the Legend of Good Women. I have them all pulled up. So if you have a request, do make.
Well, it feels like if so many people are leaving, maybe we shouldn't be doing the Chaucer. I feel like that. Like, may I just say, could we instead talk about John Mandeville? Because I'm really excited to hear about John Mandeville.
Sure, we can talk about John Mandeville. I don't have a graph for John Mandeville.
We don't need a graph. What are you finding?
Okay. Here's the funny thing about John Mandeville. Mandeville is obviously a really strange work, right? And well, okay, let me do it backwards. There's a lot of things that we can say about Mandeville. So let me ask you what you're interested in about Mandeville.
I'm just curious what sort of connections you're finding. I'm just curious about why it is that you're seeing these connections. It seems like the most interesting of the connections that I see on your graph, and so I'm wondering what it is that you're finding in your research on this.
Yes. Okay. So then
it seems like a really irrational connection to have, right?
Right. Like, what? What is that? What? Okay.
I don't know. Do you know Mandeville's travel? It's like this wacky, I don't even know what to say. Like, it's like a sort of Marco Polo science fiction. I don't even know. Like dragons and not dragons and dragons. Yeah.
And whose heads grow beneath your shoulders.
Right, exactly. That's right.
Okay, so here's the really great part, and you're gonna really love this. I know it because hang on, I'm putting it in here. Because in one manuscript in particular, this is Cambridge University Library DD 117, which is the second largest collection. So that's this big collection over here, which is not nearly as big as the Vernon, but if this weren't on the graph, this would look massive. Or sorry, if the Vernon weren't on the graph, then DD 117 would look absolutely huge. So if you look in here clearly, I don't know if this will highlight. Yes. the book of Marco Polo is in the same book, right? It's in the same codex.
Right.
So in one codex, you have a bunch of different histories of Britain. So you have like the histories of the abbots of Britain, you have the histories of the kings of Britain, you have, and then you have a couple of other kinds of histories. You have the histories of the Carolingian kings, I think. You have the Polychronicon, so you've got this nice like cosmic history, and you have two different histories of Troy, which is great. So you have all of these different histories, and then you have two different like travel narratives, one of which is a real travel narrative, and one of which is a fake travel narrative. And then you have a collection of different works on the faith of the Saracens, on Islam itself, right? And those are actually two different works. You have something on the land of the Saracens, right? Like at the very bottom, the Flos Historiam Terrae Orientis. So you have the history of the East, right? So all of these different travel works or works that are interested in travel towards the East or pilgrimage or Orientalia collected together. And then also, don't forget, you have Why Healthy Men Should Visit the Sick. So those two things together, which just drives me absolutely insane, because it's the only collection that's really like that. So I'd be really tempted to say, oh, this is a sort of anomalous situation, and maybe, sometimes we just have to allow for outliers. Sometimes manuscripts have their own agenda, and the things that the texts usually mean are being taken in another way. And I would say that, except that Mandeville occurs again and again and again. So there is a connection there. I don't know if you guys want my theory on that, but
please, yes.
All right. So this is copyright by. But my main argument is that they're both meditative journeys, and that we're reading Mandeville wrong in some ways, right? So I don't want to generalize about John Mandeville, because it is one of the single most copied texts of the late Middle Ages. Did you know that? It's
yes, we did.
Yeah, I'm surprised to find that out. Like, there's over 800 copies in at least 11 languages. So Mandeville is extremely popular, and so you can't really say that this is what Mandeville means. But when you see Mandeville and Pierce together, I start thinking about what function they could both be fulfilling, and then I start realizing that you have these narrators who go through a process of journeying in this journeying to a holy land, right? They're both seeking some kind of salvation. They're both going on some kind of pilgrimage, and they're both trying to get to the Holy Land, in whether you mean that literally or metaphorically, right? They're trying to get to heaven. So, and you also have your narrator, who is a sort of generic guy standing in, at least people make this argument about Will, that he's an everyman, right? He is the will, he's the voluntas of your average person. And I would argue that in this context, you can read Mandeville as an everyman as well. And journey, his armchair travel, is also an intellectual, a meditative journey to the Holy Land, right? We know that Mandeville wasn't a real dude who went to the Holy Land. We know that because he cobbled together these other travel texts that already existed, right? And so then I start thinking about whether or not this travel narrative serves a function of an internal pilgrimage, right? Like of meditating through the movements that one makes in order to go on pilgrimage, right? So even literal pilgrimage was a meditative process. People went through these stations, and then at each station they stopped and they had a particular interaction with the space that they were in and the grounds they were on, and they remembered certain things. And then when they had done remembering all of those things and paying the proper homage to whatever the station was, then they moved to the next station, right? So it was this kind of meditative movement through literal space. Well, Mary Carruthers argues in the Book of Memory that meditation is just a metaphorical movement of the same kind, right? So that you move in your mind from one commonplace to the next, and that brings you closer to the image of God. I mean, kind of literally in a memorial sense, because in medieval theories of memory, the more that you recalled one particular image, the more it made a physical change to your brain and reshaped the form of your internal matter, right? Like they envisioned memories being stored like a seal in wax. And so as you move through these meditative spaces, they form you as much as you recall them, right? Like they're as active in this process. So I'm thinking about Mandeville as being really a narrative of this kind of meditative journey. And my argument for making this is because it's always a renewed pilgrimage. So in the same way that Piers Plowman, not Piers, Will, in the same way that Will keeps going on pilgrimage, and then he wakes up and he's like, oh, he didn't go, right? This is one of the frustrations of this poem, is that you keep thinking you're going to do something and then you never do. Oh, we're going to go on pilgrimage, but first we're going to plow this half acre, right? Also tear up a pardon, maybe. And then you have a renewed wish for pilgrimage. You go and you say, oh, well, now we're going to go on a quest for do well, do bet, and do best, whom you never find, ever. And then at the very end of the poem, Conscience, she just throws up her hands, and this is, of course, in the B and C text, and she says, I'm going on pilgrimage. And that's how the poem ends. Wait, what have we been doing? Where did we get to in all of this? And so my argument is that it was a meditative moving through all of these topoi, these memory commonplaces, that always needs renewed in this life, right? Until you make it to the next life, you have to keep renewing. You end by going back on pilgrimage, right? And Mandeville ends the same way, right? He's got these three movements. You have him, he goes on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and for whatever reason, that's not satisfying, right? He gets there, he gets to the Holy Land, and it's not enough, so he continues to go east, right? And he's looking for Eden, which he ostensibly sort of finds, and then that's not enough. So he finds paradise on earth and keeps going east, and then finally ends up in the land of Prester John, right? So you have a third movement farther east and farther towards this kind of perfection. And what you find even in the land of Prester John is that you can't travel anywhere in this world and get to where you want to go. And the book of John Mandeville ends with this invocation to the reader that says, you are sharers in my pilgrimage with me, right? So the reading of the text is this movement towards it, and yet the pilgrimage always starts over.
Cool.
Thank you so much for that. You should know that when Claire and I first started thinking about doing this, we thought about doing something similar to what you were doing with Mandeville's manuscripts, and then we ran.
Some of us thought Anglo-Norman, and some of us thought Mandeville. But
then we ran the numbers, and we decided that you've given us a shortcut. Thank you.
Yeah, there are so many Mandeville manuscripts.
Yeah.
I would love to do that, but probably not while this is just a dissertation. Maybe I can do it for the book project, but I mean, it's a big undertaking.
Yeah, it would be a lot. So.
It would indeed.
So I see that we are at 5:30.
We should.
I don't want to. We do not wish to take you late into the night, but I don't know if anyone has any last.
Really interesting. Totally fascinating.
This is our colleague Colin Milburn, who's running our Digital Cultures Initiative. Somebody in that world, yes.
I will say one final thing. You mentioned the Amy Hollywood, Carolyn Dinshaw talk at the very beginning. I was actually in that room when she said that. We were both at NYU at the same time, so it's good to see you again. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Well, yes. Wasn't that an amazing moment, right?
It was an interesting thing, yes. You described it just right.
Yeah, so I'm really glad to see you again. I didn't realize that you were on the other coast at the same time.
Yes, I was teaching there at the time, yeah.
Before we snatched him back to over to this coast. Thank you so much. I'm going to be back in touch with you soon, and I'm looking forward to continuing to talk about all of this. But it's really great to get the overview. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yep. Thanks a lot, and we'll clap for everyone. For those who